Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this unique teaching session in the course on technology and the future of medicine. So we have David Pearce by Skype. We also have a recording of his. I've picked some sections of that recording, and then I'm thinking this will stimulate questions from you. And so I believe that much of the session will be question and answer, but we do have 76 minutes of video if we needed to use it. But that video, that 76 minutes, you also have that text, and some of it deals with the binding problem, and you had an assignment about the binding problem some time ago. So what I'm going to do first is to go to a portion of the recorded video. I'll play you about a minute and a half of that. What does this recording deal with? It deals with the question of being able to control completely the degree to which we feel pain. Or to put it another way, if you think of a spectrum between pain and pleasure, to be able to move that spectrum so that for the rest of the foreseeable future, you're only able to feel different levels of pleasure. You would no longer feel pain and suffering. Now, I think initially this is a very attractive idea. Where it gets sticky is when you think about things like guilt and remorse and the natural learning of what's dangerous in the world from, for instance, sticking your hand on a hot stove and learning that this is not a good thing to do because of the pain. But also relationships. When human relationships end, one of the tumultuous things that happens to you is the feelings of pain that you go through at that point. One of your incentives to maintain relationships is not wanting to go through that pain. So suppose that there was no pain. How would life work if you could sever relationships at will with no pain? If you never felt the pain of guilt, the pain of remorse, how would this affect human civilized interaction? So think about that now as we play this minute and a half. So this is from minutes 12:03 to about 13:05. Okay, so I'm going to change over to the other.
Actually, there is a human-friendly, indeed universally sentience-friendly alternative or complementary option to CEV that could radically enhance the well-being of humans and the rest of the living world while conserving most of our existing preference architectures. An option that is also neutral between utilitarian, deontological, virtue-based and pluralist approaches to ethics, and also neutral between multiple religious and secular belief systems. This option is radically to recalibrate all our hedonic set points so that life is animated by gradients of intelligent bliss, as distinct from the pursuit of unvarying maximum pleasure dictated by classical utilitarianism. If biological humans could be uploaded to digital computers, then our super happy uploads could presumably be encoded with exalted hedonic set points too. This conjecture assumes that classical digital computers could ever support unitary phenomenal minds, which I'm doubtful about. However, if an intelligence explosion is as imminent as some singularity theorists claim, then it's unlikely either an idealized logical reconciliation, i.e. CEV, or radical hedonic recalibration could be sociologically realistic on such short timescales.
So, first of all, do you understand the concept here of resetting the hedonic set point? So you have an experience, and the feelings it creates are much more likely to be pleasurable than painful, because you've moved the whole spectrum of one's ability to feel pleasure and pain toward the pleasure side. And thinking about then conducting all of life like that. Maybe I'll ask David to, just a second, I have to change to the other computer here. Is it laptop 2? Yes. Okay, yeah. So, David, you're on now. Tell us a little bit about how do you see the things that I mentioned? How would guilt, remorse, relationships ending, how would all this work in the world that you envision when there is no pain? How would friendships be maintained?
I think even in a world in which our hedonic set point has been radically elevated, it's still going to be feasible to have the functional analogues of guilt, remorse, sadness, disappointment, just no longer the really nasty and vicious raw feels as we experience today. Because I think that if one really loves someone and wants to enter into a relationship with someone one loves, one isn't entitled to expect them to suffer on one's account. I mean, selfishly, yes, if I experience some form of misfortune, I would want those I love and care for to diminish their well-being, but I don't think I'm ethically entitled to want them to suffer, not if I truly love them or value their friendship. So that, in a nutshell, is the position.
You know, if human goodness is a real reality, if people are naturally good, then this should work pretty well. If people are not naturally good, if they are kept in the good realm by the possibility of experiencing pain if they do something wrong, then this won't work well at all. So what's your belief about the basic human goodness of mankind? Do you believe in us as human beings? Are we basically good? Or are we all rascals just sort of kept in line by the possibility of painful experiences?
Actually, I have an extremely dark conception of humans and human life, and yes, anyone who reads up in history and evolutionary biology, it's an extraordinarily grim tale. Redeeming feature, though, is that though I think most of us are pretty morally apathetic and selfish most of the time, fortunately most of us aren't actively malevolent. I think most of us have at least a weak benevolence, and one of the opportunities opened up by the new biotechnology is we can enrich our capacity for empathetic understanding. We can augment our fragile ethical capacities. So I certainly don't see hedonic recalibration as some kind of total panacea on its own. For instance, by boosting natural native oxytocin function, we can become much more naturally empathetic towards each other, if you like, more moral, though there are many complications there. So essentially I see hedonic recalibration as simply one strand of a strategy of biological enhancement. And by enhancement, I don't just mean in the narrow sense, nor quite often you find of enhanced IQ. I also mean an enriched capacity for empathetic understanding, cooperative problem solving.
Yes. You know, my own gut feeling here, I would say that I don't think it would work very well not to have pain in the world. But I can see how it might be quite feasible to create that sort of scenario, and I think it might be very, very attractive to do so. So it's a lot different from many of the things we talk about in this course, where it's hard to really imagine them happening. It's kind of theoretical that they would happen. Here I can easily imagine how this might happen through genetic manipulation and other means, that you change this hedonic set point. So I can imagine that happening quite easily. What I can't imagine is a world working smoothly like that. What is your feel? How likely is this to happen? You say at one point in what you've written that if the Kurzweilian future moves as quickly as people think, that there won't be time for this to happen. Do you still think that we might lose out in the possibility of creating this world with the reset hedonic set point, just because the exponential change would be moving forward so quickly, and other things would happen to prevent it?
It's certainly possible. As you probably gathered, I'm rather skeptical that in the year 2046 or even in the year 2066 there's going to be a momentous world-changing event in which humans become immortal. But yes, in terms of looking further ahead, distant timescales, it's very natural to think this kind of change will be incredibly slow and gradual. But it's worth stressing that even now, if we wanted to do so, we could use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to, for instance, choose benign alleles for our future offspring rather than play a genetic Russian roulette. I mean, something like the COMT gene with two particular variant alleles, one predisposing to a much higher hedonic set point than the other. Which would you choose? Would you rely on God or Mother Nature, or would you do what I would say, other things being equal, is the responsible thing? Now, this isn't even in the strict sense genetic engineering, because one is relying on what nature has already thrown up. I think we will, in longer run, be heading towards an era of designer zygotes, but pre-implantation genetic diagnosis doesn't involve the charge even strictly of eugenics. Now, perhaps it's natural to say, well, this is experimenting with our future children, but all children are unique genetic experiments, and if one is going to bring more life into the world, I think one has an obligation not, if possible, to bring unnecessary suffering into the world. And though the idea of life based on ingredients of intelligent bliss sounds as though it's complete science fiction, one can look today at some of the very happiest hypothymic people. Some can still, they're not clinically manic, so it's not out of control dysfunction. Some hypothymic people can be extraordinarily productive. Take, for instance, Anders Sandberg, and I promise I use him as a case study with his express permission. He is someone who is naturally extraordinarily hypothymic, and yet, of course, as anyone knows Anders, he is fabulously productive. Now, clearly, there would be profound sociological implications if the entire population were to have their hedonic set points recalibrated like this, but nonetheless, the quality of life most people would enjoy would be immeasurably higher than is so often the case now.
Right. Now, we have in this class quite a spectrum of students, and I'd like to keep this session in a realm that is relevant to their lives, rather than have them feel that they experience something that just doesn't fit with anything else they do or know. So let me ask you, in your own personal life, there must be ordinary people that you interact with. Your barber, the doorman, ordinary people who actually have learned that you hold these kinds of beliefs. You think about these sorts of things. So give me a kind of spectrum of how do the people in your life react to this? Is it uniformly favorable? Do they all think you're a great guy and you've just got the best ideas about the future? Or is, for instance, your barber highly skeptical, or the doorman, or some of the other people with relatively standard kind of lives? What do they think about what you're up to, what you do? Do they think that you're holding a legitimate place in society, or that you're just fooling around and pretending to work? What's their feeling?
Well, I don't know. Given the state of my hair, I don't think anyone's ever suggested I've had a barber before. No, I promise, here in Brighton, where I live, I lead a very kind of quiet, nondescript life, go to the coffee shop once a day and then retreat to my computer. Just occasionally a visitor comes down imagining I'm leading some wild, crazy, debauched, hedonistic lifestyle with lots of sort of drink, drugs and debauchery or something. No, as I said, to all intents and purposes, I impersonate a respectable, God-fearing citizen. So,
I see. So you're as near to normal as anybody we've met in this course.
Oh, heavens,
that's
yes.
Good.
Absolutely, yes.
That's good to know. Well, I think what I should do next, the students look a bit shell-shocked, but I think I shouldn't just go forward here with my own ideas about how this should proceed. So there are two things that we could do now. If there's a student who wants to come down here and interact with you directly, that could happen. Or I could go to the next video clip that I thought that we might show from your recording. So what do the students want? Is there one of you who'd like to march down here and really put some questions to David Pearce and at the moment? Yes? Okay, why don't you come down? I'm going to change over the microphone here so the student can, yeah. So here, you want to put these on and just stand here and you can, yep.
Hi. Hi, I was wondering if life would actually lose excitement. Is this on?
Yes.
I was wondering if life would actually lose excitement because of the lack of pain and other negative emotions. Because for some individuals, like myself perhaps, I like to live life either extreme, not extreme, but at the high and at the low ends, rather than always being at the middle. So.
One can certainly, hello, am I on? Yep.
Yes, you're on.
One can certainly imagine as one option amongst many a life of quiet, tranquility, introspection, reflection, sort of lotus eating if you like. But in principle, there's no reason why one can't lead an extraordinarily exhilarating and exciting life. Very, very crudely, and this is crudely, one can imagine perhaps two axes in the brain, the dopaminergic axis and the mu-opioid axis, with the dopaminergic axis mediating drive, incentive motivation, urge for excitement, hypermotivation, and on the other hand, the mu-opioid axis mediating pure bliss. And so, yes, in future we'll have the opportunity to enrich function of both axes, or for that matter, selectively one or selectively the other. So if you want to continue to lead an exhilarating life, well, I would say in future it will be possible for life to be vastly more exhilarating and exciting than anything physiologically feasible today. But equally, if on the other hand this sounds all like a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, you can choose, if you wish, to enjoy a life of quiet contemplation. Essentially, we shouldn't be slaves to our biology. Although I'm canvassing these different options, I think it's worth perhaps stressing it's not a matter of coercion, of forcing anyone to take these different options. It's enriching the space of opportunities, if you like.
Yes. So are there other students who'd like to interact directly down here at the moment? Yes? Okay. So the sound system for the room is here, and the sound system for that is here, so we've got kind of two different...
This is holding both, right?
Yeah.
Hello, David. Hi, my name is Victor.
Hi, Victor.
Okay, so this idea of hedonic calibration and elimination of pain, right? We're talking about that and how that would perhaps enhance the quality of our lives.
Hold that up closer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think an element of habituation would play into this thing? So let's say currently we can experience, pain, very bad pain at -10 on a spectrum, and then we can experience extreme pleasure at 10. So we have a range of 20. So let's say you eliminate all pain, and so you go from the spectrum, you have 0 to 10. Do you think, let's say we recalibrate our pleasure level to be at neutral, which was previously at 0, now it becomes 5, okay, hypothetically. Do you think, anything that's below 5, we would consider it as pain? And the reason I brought this up is because, I don't know if it's a good analogy, but let's say the usage of caffeine, right? I need 1 cup a day to be able to function normally now. And I need 2 cups to make me think better, etc. But if I don't drink coffee on one day, I become very, very, not being able to function really well. And do you think that plays a role? Or would that be a possibility in the future after we eliminate all sort of pain?
Yes, it's intuitively quite a compelling idea that pleasure and pain, happiness and sadness are in some sense largely or even entirely relative. But it's worth considering, for instance, people today who suffer chronic pain and or depression. Some people who spend their whole lives below hedonic 0. Now, I wouldn't, I hope, try to claim that because their life lacked contrast, that it was somehow unreal, their suffering. On the contrary, many depressives lead quite abject lives, and just as it's technically possible, sadly, to spend much of, or even all of one's life below hedonic 0, likewise there are happy, much more fortunate people who spend all or most of their lives above hedonic 0. Certainly the brain has evolved a quite vicious set of negative feedback mechanisms that currently stop us, most of us being very happy or very sad for very long. But I think it's worth recalling so-called wireheading or intracranial self-stimulation. This is not the scenario, I hasten to add, that I'm predicting or advocating for the future, but recall how a rat or a monkey, or for that matter a human who has microelectrodes placed in his or her reward centers will compulsively self-stimulate for not just minutes but for hours and hours on end. And apparently it is, the experience is still as rewarding on the 10,000th time as it is the first time. So those certain drugs, for instance, like the opioids, do induce tolerance, others induce sensitization. So that's a long roundabout way of saying that no, I don't think in the long run tolerance and habituation is going to be a problem. And as far as contrast goes, even if we were to recalibrate our hedonic set points so we enjoyed gradients of bliss, one can make these gradients, these dips and peaks arbitrarily shallow or steep as desired.
So are there other students who would like to interrogate David Pearce at this point? Thanks to the two of you who have done so. Okay, what I'm going to do now is to switch to the recording. And you know that we've talked a great deal in this course about mind uploading. And one of the surprises that I had at the Singularity Summit about 5 weeks ago was a presentation there that postulated that when mind uploading begins, there would be less than 300 human beings. These would be very unique human beings who would be actually uploaded, and we would make like trillions of copies of these less than 300 people, and then every place in the world would be like a little town where everybody knew everybody else, because everybody in the world would know the names and the characteristics of these fewer than 300 people. It was a very surprising idea, but I suppose even more surprising is maybe the idea that mind uploading is just not feasible. So what I'm going to play for you now is a portion of the recording that indicates that it's probably just not feasible. Now, this is toward the end of the lecture, and it assumes, of course, that you listen to the rest of the lecture and so on. But you've had the opportunity to do that in text for some days now, and the actual lecture today, and of course you can always listen to it later. It does make reference to the binding problem, which you had reading about some weeks ago. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the other computer and play this part of the lecture for you.
4.5. The infeasibility of mind uploading. On the face of it, the prospect of scanning, digitizing, and uploading our minds offers a way to circumvent our profound ignorance of both the hard problem of consciousness and the binding problem. Mind uploading would still critically depend on identifying which features of the mind-brain are mere substrate, i.e. incidental implementation details of our minds, and which features are functionally essential to object binding and unitary consciousness. On any coarse-grained functionalist story, at least, this challenge might seem insurmountable. Presumably the mind-brain can formally be described by the connection and activation evolution equations of a massively parallel connectionist architecture, with phenomenal object binding a function of simultaneity. Different populations of neurons, edge detectors, color detectors, motion detectors, etc., firing together to create ephemeral bound objects. But this can't be the full story. Mere simultaneity of neuronal spiking can't by itself explain phenomenal object binding. There is no one place in the brain where distributively processed features come together into multiple bound objects in a world simulation instantiated by a fleetingly unitary subjective experience. We haven't explained why a population of 80 billion ostensibly discrete membrane-bound neurons, classically conceived, isn't a zombie in the sense that 1.3 billion skull-bound Chinese minds or a termite colony is a zombie. In default of a currently unimaginable scientific or philosophical breakthrough in the understanding of consciousness, it's hard to see how our mind files could ever be uploaded to a digital computer. If a quantum mind story is true, mind uploading can't be done. In essence, two distinct questions arise here. First, given finite real-world computational resources, can a classical serial digital computer, or a massively classically parallel connectionist system, faithfully emulate the external behavior of a biological mind-brain? Second, can a classical digital computer emulate the intrinsic phenomenology of our minds, not least the multiple bound perceptual objects, simultaneously populating a unitary experiential field, apprehended or instantiated by a fleeting unitary self? If our answer to the first question were yes, then not to answer yes to the second question too might seem sterile philosophical skepticism, just a rehash of the problem of other minds, or the idle skeptical worry about inverted qualia, how can I know that when I see red you don't see blue, etc. But the problem is much more serious. Compare how, if you are given the notation of a game of chess that Kasparov has just played, then you can faithfully emulate the gameplay, yet you know nothing whatsoever about the texture of the pieces, or indeed whether the pieces had any textures at all. Perhaps the game was played online. Likewise with the innumerable textures of consciousness, with the critical difference that the textures of consciousness are the only reason our gameplay actually matters. Unless we rigorously understand consciousness and the basis of our teeming multitude of qualia, and how these qualia are bound to constitute a subjective experience, the prospect of uploading is a pipe dream. Furthermore, we may suspect on theoretical grounds that the full functionality of unitary conscious minds will prove resistant to digital emulation, and classical digital computers will never be anything but zombies.
So, it's fascinating that when we had the lecture from Marcus Hutter, I think there were many surprising things about it. And our Dean of Science, who spoke after Marcus Hutter, said that lecture was so incredibly complicated that he didn't see how the students could possibly understand it. But anyway, he said that a super sentient machine, a machine much smarter than human beings, would be conscious by definition. That just, if you make it smart enough, it becomes conscious. No problem. And that was just one of many surprising things. But maybe I felt at that moment that David Pearce would be strongly opposed to this idea that just make it smart enough and it becomes conscious. So would you like to tell us a little bit about this? Do you believe that if you make a machine smart enough, it automatically becomes conscious? No problem.
Not really. I mean, obviously one can't just define something into existence.
Right.
It's very intuitive, this notion we have that consciousness has something to do with intelligence, and that we are much more conscious somehow than lesser beings. But if you actually look at the substrates of consciousness in the mind-brain, if you look at, let's say, the most intense forms of experience it's possible to have, let's say, agony or panic or orgasm, they've got nothing to do, or very little to do, with our capacity to churn out inferences, generative syntax, or ability to solve mathematical equations. Electrode studies with humans show that they're actually located in the primitive limbic system. Yes, I'm extremely skeptical of this idea that as soon as you have this arbitrary threshold of intelligence, consciousness is going to just switch on. I mean, it becomes a miracle. Essentially, any adequate explanation is going to want to be able to rigorously derive the properties of our, I'm going to use this awful philosopher's term of art, qualia, macroqualia, from underlying microqualia, or at least sketch out how it is possible rigorously to derive them. Otherwise, one might as well say that, I don't know, the population of China, once it reaches a given degree of functional complexity, I don't know, a unitary self will switch on, will be a unitary subject of experience. I mean, I can't prove this isn't the case, but it becomes a miracle. It's not a naturalistic account of the world.
Right. So how much do you feel that philosophy is something that should be regulated? Medicine is heavily regulated. You need a license, you need you put diplomas on the wall, and you need to pass exams and all this sort of thing. Now I'm thinking, Marcus Hutter is not a philosopher, Robin Hanson is not a philosopher, I am not a philosopher. We've all sort of dabbled in philosophy, but just as I would imagine that somebody who does dedicated study of medicine is a better doctor than somebody who just dabbles in it. Do you believe the same is true of philosophy, or is philosophy unique in that the dabblers are just as good as the people who study it full time? What's your thought about this?
I think the problem is that all of us, whether we're practicing scientists or chair-bound academics or independent researchers, all of us have philosophical views. And though I've got a great deal of sympathy with practically minded people, men and women of the world, hands-on scientists who are extremely impatient with philosophers, nonetheless the penalty of not doing philosophy is just to give bad philosophical assumptions a free pass. So I think essentially that philosophers need to become much better acquainted with the natural scientists. In fairness, there are some extremely strong philosophers who do just that, but likewise computer scientists and physicists who think that they're completely uncontaminated by philosophy. I mean, candidly, I think this is naive. I mean, compare, let's say, in something, let's say, quantum physics, how the naive positivism of Bohr and the Copenhagen interpretation held back progress in quantum physics for decades. And likewise with the field of AI, let alone AGI and this prophesied singularity. We're all doing philosophy, whether we like it or not.
Yes. Yeah. So are there other students who'd like to come out here and pose a question? You know, it doesn't hurt. We're talking about pain and pleasure today. There's nothing painful about coming here, standing here. I absolutely guarantee you. As a matter of fact, it's a little bit on the fun side because of the novelty side of it. Yeah. So you kind of speak into both of them. Hold them up. Yeah.
Hey there. So my question was, I know, like, I kind of agree with you. I don't think it would be that possible to be able to put a human brain into a computer. But do you think it could be possible to simulate one close enough to an actual person's personality and, you know, even program all their past experiences and memories and things like that into it?
It depends on all sorts of facts, but I think I was considering earlier the question of something like someone who spends much of their life investigating altered states of consciousness, or if that's a little too risque for you, someone like Christoph Koch, who spends a lot of his life investigating the neural correlates of consciousness in the mind-brain. How exactly is a digital computer supposed to undertake something like this? I just wouldn't have a clue how to program, or for that matter, train up a notional neural net. Such is the depth of our ignorance. So I'm afraid this answer is rather lame. I said my hunch is to know, but I could be confounded.
Okay, other questions? It's kind of a unique day. I mean, for one thing, coming down here, you can see the live David Pearce much better than you can on the big screen. Come on, some of the rest of you must have questions, or there's no harm in repeating if some of you. What about this mind uploading thing? Do you agree completely that it's probably not practical, or do you yourself think it might be?
I could just make one comment. Yeah. It's an extremely unlikely but possible form of existential risk. Let's say if humanity comes collectively to believe that mind uploading is feasible, and collectively we decide destructively to upload ourselves into digital silicon, and yes, presumably after the transition we successfully congratulate ourselves on having made the transition and laugh at the skeptics who are doubtful about digital sentience. But unfortunately we managed to get our theory of mind wrong, and we were all zombies. I should hasten to add that I don't think this is remotely sociologically feasible, but given this week what with the news about the setting up of an institute to study existential risk in Cambridge, I would like to add that as one of the more far-fetched conceptions of existential risk.
Yes. It's remarkable in my life. There are 4 different people who've told me about this article in the last day. So it's obviously, it's even people who don't ordinarily think about such things have encountered this Cambridge phenomenon. So what would be the practical steps if you wanted to make a reality of this resetting of the hedonic spectrum? what, where would it start? How would we go about doing that? Who would make the first steps? How, you know?
Well, already we use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Now, one might imagine, well, this is just a rich man's prerogative in the West, but actually pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is used most commonly in India and China to avoid the terrible misfortune of having a girl. Now, you could argue that we have our priorities skewed, and that instead of doing what we do at the moment before having children, which is just essentially throw the genetic dice and see what happens, that instead we should routinely use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. As I said, this is not yet, at any rate, genetic engineering, but yes, one can screen for, let's say, the cystic fibrosis allele. We really want to perpetuate it, but as well as obvious genetic disorders like cystic fibrosis, we will also be able to see whether our prospective children are predisposed to, let's say, depression or anxiety disorders. And I would simply ask anyone who's skeptical. I mean, imagine if you were actually choosing the genetic dial settings for average mood, the hedonic set point of your future child. What would you choose if you did have a number of allelic variations? Or would you be happier just to throw the genetic dice and see what happens?
Yeah, it's interesting when you get into the realm of psychiatric illness. I mean, you can say, well, you know, which organ is more important and so on. The compound lithium, which is a very useful drug to treat manic illness, people taking that, even if it's so toxic to their kidneys that they'll end up with kidney failure, looked upon that as a trade-off, almost uniformly keep on taking it, because this thing having to do with mood and brain function is so much more important in their lives than, you know, kidney function. As you may know, kidney is my main interest, so this is why I've always been interested in this phenomenon. But so what does that mean? It means that if you would consider screening for some, you know, condition that would cause kidney failure, it's perhaps even more important to screen for something that would cause you difficulties in psychic or brain realm. Are there other questions here?
Consensus. I love.
Yes, yes.
I hope.
No, well, they seem, the feeling I get looking at their eyes is they're convinced in a theoretical level, but they're not convinced it has anything to do with their practical lives at all. You know, it's like, oh yeah, there's this David Pearce guy, and you know, he thinks about this stuff in theory, and but so what about it, you guys? Do you want to come down and ask him something? not try to coerce you, but I think it's probably better to do it. Sure. Yeah. So, okay, we'll pass the microphones over to you.
So I had a problem with when you're editing the hedonistic set point, what kind of effects it would have for other parts of our mental processes, such as memory retrieval and encoding. You tend to remember things that are at the high points of life and at the low points of life, which is very good for our sense of survival. But when you start moving the hedonistic set point and you start changing what kinds of neurotransmitters you're using in your brain, should we just throw out the amygdala altogether and it doesn't have a use anymore? Or should we look at other ways to start solving this problem?
Yeah, so what about that?
Yeah, an excellent question. I think before exploring truly radical forms of recalibration, it's going to be worth doing systematic case studies of the happiest hypothymic people, because though I mentioned earlier how some hypothymic people are extraordinarily productive and intelligent, nonetheless, presumably, I think this is the case, they will have certain cognitive biases. And if society as a whole were to radically shift typical hedonic set points, I mean, what would be the overall effect of, let's say, the opposite of depressive realism? I mean, is there a danger if one is naturally too cheerful and optimistic that one will lack something in the way of so-called depressive realism? Having said that, of course, we know from smart software and computers that software gets by very well indeed without the raw textures of pleasure and pain. So I don't think there's some constitutive link between the nasty raw feels of depression and pain and any particular functional role. But yes, excellent question, would need to be thoroughly researched and explored if as a society we do decide we want radically to enhance most people's lives. Perhaps I should, it's worth stressing that it's a rather grim topic, but each year around 1 million people in the year each year take their own lives, perhaps between 10 and 20 times that number attempt suicide, far more commit acts of self-harm. Perhaps hundreds of millions of people are either clinically or subclinically depressed. This enormous burden of suffering, and though clearly there are many environmental factors, there's also abundant evidence that low mood, depression, anxiety disorders have a very high degree of genetic loading. And if in the long run we're going to enrich people's quality of lives, we are going to have to tackle this issue, whether it is 10 years, 20 years, or next century.
When you say we're going to have to tackle this, it isn't probably as big as you would like the we to be in the long run. Are there other philosophers around the world working on this same problem with the same, beliefs that you have? And is it just an accident that we found you? Or are there lots of other people like you? Or are you the only one in the world working on this right now?
Well, the World Transhumanist Association, or Humanity Plus, has the commitment in the Transhumanist Declaration to the well-being of all sentience, which,
right,
if you actually think through its implications, what might seem like mere boilerplate has extraordinary ramifications, both for humans and non-humans. What I'm arguing, or at least some variant of this, is implicit in let's say, a classical utilitarian ethic, and all sorts of philosophers and all sorts of laymen would hold something like a utilitarian ethic. So yes, although I appear to be spinning this rather radical and implausible yarn, it's actually, I would say, an implication of theories and values many people already hold.
Yes. I think, though, the numbers are interesting to contemplate. In the active transhumanism community, how many people do you think there are? I mean, it seems to me it's maybe around 9,000 total. That's the number of hits on the best YouTube videos from the Singularity Summit. They never exceed 9,000. On the other hand, how many people are there in the Western world who might conceivably be co-opted into an interest in this? Well, if you look at the NOVA program on PBS television, that reaches 100 million. So, I mean, we've got the difference between maybe the 9,000 transhumanist community and the 100 million people out there who are interested in science and general, how would you suggest that we go between the 9,000 and the 100 million? Or should we even try? You know, in a lot of fan movements, people like the number of fans to remain small because it makes them feel unique and, you know, purposeful. And if they're just one of 100 million, that would be like soul destroying. So number one, how could we go from the 9,000 to 100 million? And secondly, should we?
As someone who believes that we have an overriding moral obligation to phase out all forms of involuntary suffering, both in humans and non-humans, I would very much argue that we should try and spread these kind of radical transhumanist ideas. The actual mechanism by which we do this, as I said, I am not a professional publicist or PR person. Hats off to Ray Kurzweil, front cover of Time magazine, 2046, the year humans become immortal. Yes, truly enviable and impressive. I think the actual influence of transhumanist ideas is wildly disproportionate to the number of people who go around calling themselves transhumanists. And it's notable that in spite of what one might naively imagine, transhumanism is not a cult. There are no badges, there are no rallies, there are no secret signs or anything like that. Ultimately, it is a matter, I would say, of spreading a set of ideas. And that's a long roundabout way of saying that I haven't got a detailed 10-point blueprint by which we're going to persuade the rest of the world, but I'm cautiously optimistic that this is going to be feasible.
Well, you know, it's an open question. What could this course accomplish? Is this course accomplishing anything? Will it accomplish anything? You know, will it have any impact in the world? And I think you can imagine there might be people sitting in these seats who would make the difference between the 9,000 and the 100 million. And we can't judge that right away, but it's possible. You know, we have young people here, and you know, in some sense, the future of the world depends upon young people doing things, right? So I'm hopeful that maybe some of these changes will start here, even though, you know, we're the only Canadian major city off the U.S. map. So every other city in Canada hugs the U.S. border, is on the U.S. map. So we're a little bit remote. You could argue that what we do here doesn't matter worth a damn because, you know, we're way out of the mainstream of human endeavor. But still, I'm hopeful that we will, you know, accomplish some meaningful things up here in the frozen north. It isn't actually that frozen today. It's a reasonably pleasant day. Okay, other students to interrogate David Pearce? Yeah, sure.
Hello, David. It's me again.
Hi.
Hi. Well, so I put some thought into this, and just going back to your point about how, okay, so if we abolish all pain, and you explained the significance of that, right? There are so many people suffering from mental disorders. You know, 20% of people will suffer from depression sometime at some point in their lives. And I was just thinking, mental disorders are defined by comparisons to the norm of the society, right? At least in our current society. And so, let's say we abolish all physical pain, and let's say depression is gone, so that spectrum from like -10 to 0 is gone, right? From 0, and now we have from 0 to 10, which is maximum pleasure. And if we make the assumption that the norm becomes 5, right? If mental disorders are defined by comparison, by comparing people's thoughts, behaviors to the norm, do you think we'll still have depression and that type of stuff once all pain is gone?
Ah, I suspect all of us today, by the standards of post-humans, would be regarded as severely sick and dysfunctional. I think in the long run we're going to need a much richer conception of mental health. That yes, I think the overriding urgency at the moment is to tackle the cases of severe suffering, depression, pain disorders. But once one has phased out all involuntary suffering in this manner, the question is, should we settle for mediocrity, or should we go on and aim for the sublime? And though, as someone who happens to be a negative utilitarian, I'm not convinced that we have a sacred obligation to do so, I suspect that in the long run that is quite likely, and that more distant descendants are likely to live lives essentially animated by gradients of bliss that are orders of magnitude richer than anything accessible today. It'd be simplistic to identify pleasure with value, but nonetheless, pleasure, if you like, is the engine of value, and that here's just a rather trite example, but it makes my point, I think, well enough, that and I faithfully score my music collection between 1 and 5, but imagine if you were to listen to music and the level of reward and enjoyment and sense of the sublime range from the 10 to the 50. Would one really want to explore what music was like when the best you got was 5? As I said, that is rather trite and pathetic, but nonetheless, why settle for the mediocre?
One thing that Marcus Hutter suggested is that of the people teaching in this course, that I should put together a panel and have them, interrogate each other. So does that seem like something you would like to do? Would you be interested? We have this detailed lecture from Marcus Hutter. It's a 50-minute lecture, but probably to understand every PowerPoint slide would take years. Study is a very complex thing. Then there's Robin Hansen's lecture, which exists online from the Singularity Summit. James Hughes is talking with us this Thursday, 2 days from now. Would that interest you, that idea of putting people together and having a panel? What I would say is it's even less predictable than today. If I was worried about the free form of not having a clue what was going to happen today, it'd be 10 times worse if I put 4 of you together. Does that sound like anything useful would be accomplished, or would it just be chaotic? Are you too different from Marcus Hutter for any useful communication to occur, or would it?
I would love to think there would be a harmonious meeting of minds. I love consensus.
Yes.
Yes, I suspect there might be certain disagreements of emphasis, perhaps.
Yeah, well, we might try something like that the next time. I think it would be intriguing. What I was happy about today is the quality of the questions from the students. I think they seem to ask you just as good things as what I was asking you, and I'm very proud of that. I don't think they're just having a good day. I think they're actually good students. So anyway, I think what happened with Marcus Hutter was he was disappointed in his own performance. It wasn't that he didn't like the video of the question period because of the students. It's that, I don't know, he thought from a marketing point of view that he needed something with a bit more luster than that. So interestingly, he has forbidden us from showing the video of that question period anywhere, which is that's like the lowest point that this course has reached. But it's an interesting phenomenon. I actually think this session today will be very watchable. Your Skype image is very good, and it's been very, consistent, and so it is almost as good as your being here. It doesn't look that good on the screen because we've got the light, contamination, but I'm, recording it on my own laptop, and I think the quality of that will be quite good. So, in a sense, you really were here, David. It's just you saved yourself all that pain and suffering of getting on the aircraft and, sitting in the seats and maybe getting blood clot that went to your lungs. I mean, you can die, from flying somewhere. So you saved all that risk by staying home and Skyping with us. We've still got 12 minutes, guys. Stefan, you're the youngest person here. Why don't you... So Stefan began taking this course when he was 17. I think he's 18 now. And so he's got the kind of ideas that a young person would have.
Hi there.
Hi, Stefan.
Hey, I'm just curious, when you're talking about moving these set points on how people feel pleasure and pain, how would one go about being able to move these certain set points? Like, would this be through medication or therapy, or how would you do that?
In the case of our future children, hello, am I on?
Yes, you're on.
In the case of our future children, it is a matter of pre-selecting particular alleles and allelic variations. Now, one can't yet routinely do this with adult humans like you or me, which is why, for the foreseeable future at least, it would be necessary to use some form of drug therapy, by which I don't mean recreational drugs, but various mood brighteners. Now, clearly this has psychoactive drugs have all kinds of pitfalls, and so this should be done very cautiously indeed. I mean, all sorts of drugs, of course, temporarily enhance one's well-being, motivation and the like, but they are followed by a crash. They simply kick into gear the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain. Looking ahead slightly further, however, it should be possible within the next few decades for adult humans to genetically modify their own source code, and that includes resetting our own, crudely speaking, hedonic set points. And this probably sounds quite implausible. Surely most people aren't going to become molecular biologists and geneticists, but recall that it's highly likely some extremely forms of sophisticated, user-friendly software and authoring tools will become available that will shield the end user from some of the messiness. So, yes, particularly younger members of the audience, it will be possible, in a sense, to redesign oneself and, yes, choose one's average level of well-being, empathy, and motivation in the way that just simply isn't possible today.
What I think is that, if you compare something like mind uploading, which we talk about a lot, but we honestly don't know how to do, compared to this change that you're talking about, where the research is there, and I mean, we don't know how to do it right now. We don't know how to do it in quantity, but there's really no hurdle there that we haven't already crossed in terms of making it at least theoretically possible. So it seems like at the moment this resetting of the hedonic set point is more likely than mind uploading. So it's a very interesting phenomenon from that point of view. Other questions? Hannah, you want to? Want to get a good gender mix here? Questions too? You can hold it up. Yep.
Hi.
Hi.
So, from pain or negative feelings, we know that something's wrong. Usually, like, let's say physical pain, we say, oh, something's wrong, I need to go see a doctor, or I need to check things out. Or from a loss of someone who's special, we feel, I guess, regrets and sadness, and we know that's how we learn that someone is special to you, and that's how we learn about the person's worth. So what do you think this, I guess, having the technology to not feel this negative pain and increase the pleasure we get, I guess, have on these kind of learnings or feelings?
I think what is critical to learning is not our absolute point on the pleasure-pain axis, but to preserve informational sensitivity. And one can be learning, assuming we still opt to use the pleasure-pain axis, its information signaling role, assuming we want to continue use it for this function, then one can learn from dips of sublime well-being that never cease themselves to be wonderful. Use a rather earthy example, and perhaps philosophers shouldn't do this, but consider two people making love. Some aspects of love-making are even richer and more enjoyable than others, but those that are slightly less enjoyable aren't somehow nasty. And likewise, as I said, in a future world in which sentient beings are animated by gradients of bliss, learning can be amplified too. Indeed, it's highly likely, I think.
Yeah, it seems likely that we would want the option of turning off pain and suffering. There might be situations where it's just useful to have it there, you know, like the learning of a young child about the dangers of fire and the hot stove and so on. I mean, you can think of other ways the child could learn this if it couldn't feel pain, but it's actually darn useful. I mean, usually the burn that the child gets isn't very severe, but now they know and they're not going to do it again, you know?
I mean, the obvious thing to do, for now at least, rather than completely abolish pain, is simply, for instance, choose for your future child a benign variant of the SCN9A gene, which ensures that your child has a high pain threshold. If you recall, for the SCN9A gene, complete nonsense mutations yield a congenital insensitivity to pain, which causes all sorts of problems. Other alleles confer much greater or lesser pain sensitivity, and one can be still highly functional and yet at the same time have a high pain threshold. And so, although in the long run, one can imagine with utopian technology having, let's say, smart prostheses and the small child automatically, his or her limb withdraws from the fire, for the foreseeable future, one could immensely reduce the burden of suffering just by tweaking pain thresholds.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Any other questions? Bill, Seraphin, yeah? Good.
So we talked a little bit about the hard problem consciousness and intellectual zombies. And I was wondering, kind of maybe as an offshoot, would the presence of pain to a certain extent define a level of consciousness? Because computers do not feel pain right now. We don't usually program pain into a digital system because it doesn't serve us any purpose. But is that sort of integral, or could it be integral to a portion of how we feel that we are conscious?
Could you possibly clarify that point a little more? Sorry, could you...
Well, for instance, we take in sensory information. and we output a behavioral response. So our consciousness lies somewhere between the sense and the response. And some of that sense, a lot of it which is very salient for us, is painful stimuli. And so how could we tell that we have a conscious being if we don't have an analog to something that is painful?
Well, as one knows from the phenomenon of neuropathic pain, that is pain that isn't serving any kind of information processing role, that painful experience seems to be an intrinsic property of certain configurations of matter and energy, that natural selection has somehow recruited for an information processing. Sorry, I wasn't entirely clear about the question. This is probably my, I hasten to add, this is not that the question was obscure or anything.
Yeah, so, okay, well, we're getting toward the end of the session. I want to thank you very much. You know, we do professional video editing on this. We've never had quite this kind of content before, so it'll take us a few days to figure out how to edit it. I had an intriguing morning because I thought, well, the students always get a PowerPoint. They should get a PowerPoint today. And you hadn't provided one. I thought, well, maybe I should do one. It's pretty hard to find pictures of these subjects that would not offend anybody. I mean, we've got a spectrum of people here, and I ultimately figured out that there was really no advantage of my selecting a few pictures to put here. But it would be interesting, as I pointed out, if you wished to. It's certainly something we could do. If you wanted to put some sort of PowerPoint together, we could insert those slides.
This is coming. Apologies. I tell you what happens is I overpromise and underdeliver. Which is, my life is chaotic, shall we say.
Yes. Well, I think I learned today that it's better for you to pick the pictures in this area than me. And I don't think there's any particular advantage to my picking a few pictures and bringing them here. So this is the first session we've ever had with no PowerPoint at all, I think. So it's kind of interesting from that point of view. Yeah, so if you could send us a PowerPoint later, that would be great. We have the class in a room that holds 400, and there are 400 in the class following us. So they're accumulating out there in the hallway. If we don't leave, they'll come in here and trample us, or something terrible will happen. So I'm afraid we're going to have to call it a day. But thank you very, very much. We look forward to this, and you've exceeded our wildest expectations. So there.
Kim, you're a star. Thanks very much, and thank you very much to the audience for some very probing and interesting questions. Thank you very much.
Okay,
indeed.
great. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay.